It is a fact of life that firearms are loud. A shooter who does not wear their hearing protection device properly risks hearing loss. Due to the short duration of firearm impulse noise, some shooters choose to go without hearing protection as they believe that some firearms are not loud enough to damage their ears. But this is a mistake, as nearly all firearms are loud enough to cause permanent hearing loss. A suppressor can lower firearm muzzle blast noise by about 30 decibels. This is a 1,000 times reduction in noise intensity or an 8 times reduction in loudness, but does not make a firearm silent. Suppressors are typically depicted by the media as tools of the police and military, or misused by criminals. But suppressors have been marketed to the general public in the United States for over 100 years. Maxim marketed his suppressors to sportsmen and encouraged their use as training aids for novice shooters. Suppressor use in the United States declined greatly in 1934 due to the strict controls and the $200 tax placed on them, as few people were willing to pay that much tax for a small muffler that might only cost $5. The $200 tax back in 1934 is equivalent to over $3,000 today. Suppressors are legal to own in the United States, although 12 states, including Minnesota, prohibit their possession by civilians. Missouri and Kansas most recently amended their laws to allow civilian ownership. Washington State amended their code to allow the use of registered suppressors. Most states require that suppressors be registered with the federal government to own them. Federal law requires that an individual obtain ATF authorization prior to making or purchasing a suppressor. ATF authorization to possess a suppressor is granted provided the individual lives in a state that permits it and as long as they submit the application properly. All legally possessed suppressors are registered with the ATF, even those owned by state and federal government agencies. Minnesota law defines a suppressor as a device designed to silence or muffle the report of a firearm. Possession in Minnesota is a felony with one exception. The police are allowed to possess suppressors for tactical emergency response operations. Some states that do not permit civilian suppressor possession make an exception for licensed dealers, the police, and military. But Minnesota statute does not make an exception for the military or licensed dealers. This forces the police to obtain suppressors from out-of-state sources. Certain members of the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources were allowed to use suppressors for wildlife control operations, but this provision expired on July 1, 2011. Many people wrongly believe that suppressors are illegal in the United States due to some sort of crime problem associated with their use. The reality is that suppressors are very rarely associated with violent crime in the USA. Less than 1% of firearm crime in the United States is associated with suppressors. Criminal misuse of suppressors is also rare in Minnesota. Suppressor possession is very strictly controlled by the federal government. Any person that wishes to purchase a suppressor must submit an application called the ATF Form 4 to the ATF. This application must be signed by the local sheriff to show that he or she does not know of any reason why the applicant cannot possess a suppressor. The sheriff is not under any obligation to sign except when required by state law. Tennessee is an example of a state that requires a signature if the applicant is allowed to own a firearm. The application is sent to the ATF along with a form attesting to legal residence. Also included are the applicant's photos, fingerprints, and a check for $200. After an FBI background check is performed, the application is approved in about 3 to 6 months. The ATF will authorize an individual to buy a suppressor unless the applicant is not allowed to own firearms, lives in a state that prohibits them, or fills out the application wrong. There are severe penalties for criminal misuse of suppressors or simply evading the transfer tax. Use of a suppressor in a violent or drug-related crime can result in prison terms of 20 years to life and fines of up to $250,000. Simply failing to pay the $200 tax can result in a 10-year prison term as well as a $10,000 fine. Americans who go to the time and expense to own a suppressor rarely ever misuse them. Minnesota can benefit by changing our statute to allow possession of suppressors that are registered in accordance with federal law. This change will merely bring Minnesota law in line with federal law. It will allow federally licensed firearm dealers to sell suppressors to the police and individuals by obtaining the authorization of the ATF. It will eliminate the unnecessary red tape required for their possession and use by the Minnesota police. It will also restore the DNR's ability to use them for wildlife control operations.